October 15th, 1935. A smoke-filled room in Midtown Manhattan. Around a polished mahogany table sat the most powerful criminals in America. These were not street thugs or common gangsters. These were the architects of the modern underworld, the men who had transformed scattered ethnic gangs into a sophisticated criminal empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. At the head of that table sat Charles Lucky Luciano, the quiet Sicilian who had revolutionized organized crime. But on this particular night, the carefully constructed order he had built was about to be challenged in the most dangerous way possible. Dutch Schultz stood up. His face was red, his hands were shaking, and his voice carried the edge of a man who had been pushed too far. The other bosses watched in tense silence as Schultz began to rant, his anger spilling over like gasoline on hot coals. He was talking about a prosecutor, a relentless crusader named Thomas Dewey, who had been hunting him for months, freezing his assets, questioning his associates, building a case that could send Schultz to prison for decades. And Schultz had a solution. He wanted to kill Dewey. He wanted to put a bullet in the prosecutor's head and end the problem once and for all. Lucky Luciano said no. So did the others. Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, Meyer Lansky. They all said the same thing. Killing a federal prosecutor would bring heat like the underworld had never seen. It would be the end of everything they had built. It would turn every cop, every fed, every politician against them. It was suicide. But Dutch Schultz was not a man who accepted no for an answer. And then it happened. Dutch Schultz pulled a gun. He yanked a revolver from his coat and slammed it on the table. Some say he pointed it directly at Luciano. Others say he waved it in the air, his finger dangerously close to the trigger. The room froze. In that single moment, the entire future of organized crime hung in the balance. Because pulling a gun on Lucky Luciano, threatening the commission, challenging the very structure they had created, that was not just disrespect. That was a death sentence. 8 days later, Dutch Schultz was dead. To understand what happened in that room, to understand why pulling a gun on Lucky Luciano was the last mistake Dutch Schultz would ever make, you need to understand the world these men had built and the brutal logic that governed it. This is not a story about random violence or gangster bravado. This is a story about power, about order, about the cold mathematics of survival in a world where weakness meant death and defiance meant war. This is the story of how Lucky Luciano became the most powerful criminal in America, how Dutch Schultz challenged that power, and how the underworld responded with swift and merciless justice. The year was 1935, and America was emerging from the chaos of Prohibition. For 13 years, the 18th Amendment had made alcohol illegal, and in doing so, it had created the greatest criminal opportunity in American history. Gangsters who had once fought over street corners and protection rackets suddenly found themselves running operations worth millions. Speakeasies, bootlegging, rum running from Canada and the Caribbean. These enterprises demanded organization, cooperation, and violence on an industrial scale. And nowhere was that transformation more dramatic than in New York City. New York in the 1920s and early 30s was a city of territories. The Irish controlled the docks. The Jews ran the garment district and gambling operations. The Italians, split into various factions, fought over bootlegging routes and neighborhoods. And overseeing it all, at least in theory, were the old world bosses, men like Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. Sicilians who clung to the traditions of the mafia from the old country. They believed in absolute loyalty to the boss, in ethnic purity, in the old ways of doing business. But a new generation was rising, men who saw the limitations of the old system, men who understood that the future belonged not to the most violent or the most traditional, but to the most organized. Lucky Luciano was one of those men. Born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily in 1897, he had come to America as a child and grown up in the brutal streets of Manhattan's Lower East Side. He learned early that survival required more than toughness. It required intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to see opportunities others missed. While other gangsters fought over territory, Luciano built alliances. He worked with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. He partnered with Italians from different regions, breaking the old Sicilian codes. And most importantly, he understood that the chaos of gang warfare was bad for business. By the early 1930s, Luciano had concluded that the old bosses had to go. Masseria and Maranzano were dinosaurs, relics of a world that no longer existed. Their constant wars, their refusal to work with non-Italians, their inability to see beyond personal vendettas, all of it was holding back the potential of organized crime. And so, in one of the most audacious moves in criminal history, Luciano orchestrated the murders of both men. In April of 1931, Masseria was shot dead in a Coney Island restaurant. In September of that same year, Maranzano was stabbed and shot in his Manhattan office. The old order was dead, and Lucky Luciano stood ready to build something new. What Luciano created was the Commission. It was not a term that existed in the popular imagination yet, not something the newspapers wrote about or the police understood. But within the underworld, it was revolutionary. The Commission was a ruling body composed of the heads of the major crime families in New York and other cities. It was designed to settle disputes, approve major operations, and most importantly, prevent the kind of wars that drew police attention and disrupted business. It was organized crime, emphasis on organized, no more blood feuds, no more territorial wars, just cold, calculated business decisions, and it worked. For the first time, the various factions of the underworld operated with a degree of coordination that made them far more powerful and far wealthier than they had ever been. Luciano became the chairman, the first among equals, the man whose judgment shaped the direction of organized crime in America. He was not a dictator. He was something more subtle and more dangerous. He was a consensus builder, a strategist who understood that real power came not from fear alone, but from the ability to make others see that cooperation was in their best interest. But not everyone adapted to this new world. Dutch Schultz was one of those men. Arthur Flegenheimer, known to the world as Dutch Schultz, was everything Lucky Luciano was not. Where Luciano was subtle, Schultz was blunt. Where Luciano built alliances, Schultz made enemies. Where Luciano thought in terms of systems and structures, Schultz thought in terms of immediate profit and personal power. Born in the Bronx in 1902, Schultz had risen through the ranks of the underworld through sheer brutality and business acumen. He controlled the numbers racket in Harlem, a gambling operation that generated millions of dollars a year. He ran beer distribution operations. He owned restaurants and nightclubs. By the early 1930s, he was one of the wealthiest gangsters in New York. But Schultz had a problem. He was volatile, unpredictable. He had a temper that could explode without warning, and when it did, people died. He was known for beating his own men, for killing rivals in spectacularly violent ways, for acting on impulse rather than strategy. The other bosses tolerated him because he was profitable and because, despite his flaws, he was effective. But they did not trust him. And in the world Luciano had built, trust was currency. Schultz also had another problem. His name was Thomas Edmund Dewey. Dewey was a federal prosecutor, young, ambitious, and utterly incorruptible. In a city where almost everyone could be bought, where cops took bribes and judges looked the other way, Dewey was a true believer in the law. He had been appointed as a special prosecutor to investigate organized crime in New York, and he had set his sights on Dutch Schultz. Dewey was methodical. He did not just go after street-level criminals. He built cases against the bosses, following the money, interviewing witnesses, building evidence that could survive in court, and he was good at it, very good. By 1935, Dewey had indicted Schultz on tax evasion charges. It was the same strategy that had brought down Al Capone in Chicago 4 years earlier. You might not be able to prove murder or racketeering, but you could prove that a man who lived like a millionaire had not paid his taxes. Schultz's assets were frozen. His operations were under surveillance. His associates were being questioned. The walls were closing in, and Dutch Schultz could feel it. And that was when Schultz came to the commission with his proposal. Kill Dewey. Eliminate the threat. Send a message that the mob was not to be trifled with. The other bosses listened in stunned silence. Luciano's expression did not change, but those who knew him could see the calculation behind his eyes. Killing a federal prosecutor was not like killing a rival gangster. It was not even like killing a cop, though that too was generally forbidden. Killing Dewey would bring down the full weight of the federal government. It would turn organized crime from a tolerated nuisance into a national priority. Every agent, every prosecutor, every politician looking to make a name would come after them. It would be the end of everything they had built. Luciano explained this to Schultz calmly, rationally. Others chimed in. Meyer Lansky, the mathematical genius behind much of the mob's financial operations, laid out the numbers. The cost-benefit analysis was clear. Killing Dewey would cost them everything and gain them nothing. Schultz would still be indicted, still face trial, still likely go to prison. The only difference would be that the entire underworld would go down with him. But Dutch Schultz did not care about cost-benefit analysis. He did not care about the long-term stability of the commission. He cared about his freedom, his empire, and his ego. And when it became clear that the commission would not authorize the hit on Dewey, Schultz's temper exploded. Witnesses to that meeting, men who would later tell their stories to law enforcement or to historians, described a scene of escalating tension. Schultz began yelling, accusing the others of cowardice, of betraying him, of caring more about their own safety than about loyalty. And then, in a moment that would seal his fate, Dutch Schultz reached into his coat and pulled out a gun. What happened next depends on who you ask. Some say he pointed the gun directly at Lucky Luciano, his finger on the trigger. Others say he simply slammed it on the table, a gesture of defiance and frustration. Still others claim he waved it in the air, threatening everyone and no one at the same time. But the specific details do not matter. What mattered was the act itself. In pulling that gun, Dutch Schultz had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. In the world Lucky Luciano had built, violence was a tool, not a tantrum. It was something to be used strategically, deliberately, and only when necessary. Pulling a gun on the commission, threatening the very men who made up the ruling body of organized crime, was not strategy. It was chaos. It was the old world asserting itself against the new, and it could not be tolerated. The meeting ended shortly after. Schultz stormed out, still ranting about Dewey, still convinced that he was right and everyone else was wrong. The other bosses remained behind, and then they did what the commission was designed to do. They deliberated, they weighed the options, they considered the consequences. And they came to a unanimous decision. Dutch Schultz had to die. It was not personal. It was business. Schultz had become a liability. His plan to kill Dewey threatened all of them. His volatility made him unpredictable. His defiance of the commission undermined the entire structure they had built, and perhaps most importantly, allowing him to live after pulling a gun in that meeting would signal weakness. It would tell every ambitious gangster in New York that the commission could be challenged, that threats and violence could be used to get what you wanted. That was a message Lucky Luciano could not afford to send. The contract was given to a man named Charles Workman, a professional killer who worked for the Newark crew. The orders were clear: make it clean, make it fast, and make sure Dutch Schultz knows why it is happening. 8 days passed. For Schultz, those days must have been agonizing. He knew the commission had rejected his proposal. He knew he had lost his temper. But did he know how badly he had miscalculated? Did he realize that pulling that gun had been a death sentence? Or did he convince himself that the other bosses would not dare move against him, that his wealth and power would protect him? We will never know. Because on the night of October 23, 1935, Dutch Schultz walked into the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. It was a restaurant Schultz frequented, a place where he felt safe. He was there with 3 associates: Otto Berman, his accountant, Abe Landau, his bodyguard, and Lulu Rosenkrantz, another trusted man. They sat at a back table eating dinner, discussing business, the mundane details of running a criminal empire. Schultz at some point got up and walked to the bathroom. It was a small room, unremarkable, the kind of place where a man might go to relieve himself or to make a phone call in private. While Schultz was in the bathroom, the front door of the restaurant opened. 2 men walked in. They were dressed well, not flashy, just 2 men who could blend into any crowd. One of them was Charles Workman. The other was another killer whose name has been lost to history. They moved quickly, professionally. They walked past the bar, past the few other patrons, straight to the back table where Schultz's men were sitting. And then they opened fire. The sound of gunshots shattered the quiet evening. Abe Landau, the bodyguard, was hit multiple times. He managed to pull his own gun and fire back, but the assassins were already moving, already executing their plan with the precision of men who had done this before. Otto Berman was shot in the head. Lulu Rosenkrantz took bullets to the chest and stomach. All 3 men collapsed, blood pooling on the floor of the restaurant. But Dutch Schultz was still in the bathroom. Charles Workman knew this. He had studied the layout of the restaurant, knew Schultz's habits, knew that the boss often stepped away from the table. Workman moved to the bathroom door and kicked it open. Inside, he found Dutch Schultz standing at the urinal. Schultz turned, his hand moving toward his gun, but he was too slow. Workman fired once, the bullet tearing into Schultz's abdomen. Schultz staggered, his hand clutching the wound, and collapsed against the wall. Workman did not fire again. 1 shot was enough. A gut shot was slow, painful, and almost always fatal. Schultz would die, but not immediately, and that was part of the message. Quick deaths were merciful. Dutch Schultz did not deserve mercy. The assassins fled the scene, disappearing into the Newark night. When the police arrived minutes later, they found a scene of carnage. 3 men dead or dying, and Dutch Schultz still alive, lying on the bathroom floor in a spreading pool of blood. Schultz was rushed to the hospital. For 22 hours, he clung to life, drifting in and out of consciousness. The police stationed officers at his bedside, hoping he would name his killers. But Schultz was delirious, the pain and the blood loss breaking down his mind. He rambled incoherently, speaking in fragments and riddles. A stenographer took down his words, creating one of the strangest documents in criminal history, a transcript of a dying man's final thoughts. Some of his words were pleas, some were memories, some were threats directed at people long dead or far away. But never once did Dutch Schultz name the men who shot him. Never once did he break the code of silence that governed the underworld. Even in death, even betrayed and broken, he held to that one unbreakable rule. On October 24th, 1935, at 6:54 in the evening, Dutch Schultz died. He was 33 years old. He had been one of the richest, most powerful gangsters in America. And in the end, he died alone, in a hospital bed, because he had made the fatal mistake of challenging Lucky Luciano and the commission. The newspapers covered the story extensively. The public was fascinated by the violence, the drama, the larger-than-life personalities. But the newspapers did not understand what had really happened. They saw it as just another gang killing, another example of criminals turning on each other. They did not see the larger story, the structural story, the story of how the underworld had evolved from chaos into order. Because the death of Dutch Schultz was not just about one man defying another. It was about the triumph of organization over individualism. Dutch Schultz represented the old way, the gangster who operated on instinct and emotion, who saw power as personal and absolute. Lucky Luciano represented the new way, the criminal as businessman, the gangster who understood that true power came from systems, from rules, from structures that outlasted any individual. And the commission had sent a message: challenge the system, pull a gun on the ruling body, threaten to bring down heat on everyone with reckless actions, and you will be eliminated. It did not matter how rich you were. It did not matter how powerful. The commission was the ultimate authority, and defiance meant death. In the weeks and months after Schultz's death, the underworld absorbed his operations. His numbers racket in Harlem was divided among other families. His assets were liquidated. His men found new bosses or left the business entirely. It was as if Dutch Schultz had never existed, his empire dismantled and distributed with the cold efficiency of a corporate merger. And Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor Schultz had wanted to kill? He lived. He continued his crusade against organized crime, eventually becoming the governor of New York and running for president. The decision not to kill Dewey proved to be the right one. Schultz's death attracted far less attention than Dewey's would have. The underworld survived, thrived even, because Lucky Luciano had refused to let one man's anger dictate strategy. Years later, after Luciano had been convicted on prostitution charges and deported to Italy, after the commission had evolved and adapted to new challenges, people would ask what made Lucky Luciano so effective. How did a Sicilian immigrant from the Lower East Side become the most powerful criminal in America? The answer, in many ways, lay in that moment when Dutch Schultz pulled a gun. Because Luciano understood something that Schultz never could. He understood that in a world of violence, the truly powerful man is the one who knows when not to use violence. He understood that strength lay not in domination but in persuasion, not in fear alone but in making others see that cooperation served their interests. He understood that the rules mattered, that the structure mattered, that the moment you allowed emotions and egos to override strategy, you had already lost. Dutch Schultz pulled a gun because he thought it would make him look strong. He thought it would intimidate the other bosses, force them to back his play, prove that he was not a man to be trifled with. Instead, it proved that he was a relic, a gangster from an earlier era who had not adapted to the new world Luciano had built. And that world had no room for men like Dutch Schultz. The story of that meeting, of the gun on the table, of the 8 days between defiance and death, it became legend in the underworld. Young gangsters heard about it and learned the lesson. Respect the commission. Follow the rules. Control your temper. Because the alternative was a bullet in a bathroom, a lonely death in a hospital, and your empire carved up and forgotten. Lucky Luciano went on to solidify his control over organized crime in New York and beyond. The commission he created lasted for decades, governing the underworld with a combination of violence and diplomacy that proved remarkably effective. Other bosses would challenge it over the years. Some would succeed for a time. But the fundamental structure, the idea that organized crime needed organization, that remained. And every time a would-be rebel considered defying the system, every time a gangster let his ego override his judgment, someone would remind him of Dutch Schultz. They would tell the story of the man who pulled a gun on Lucky Luciano. They would describe the bathroom in Newark, the blood on the floor, the delirious ramblings of a dying man who had thought he was untouchable, and they would ask the simple question that governed that world and still governs it today. Is your pride worth your life? For Dutch Schultz, the answer was yes, and 8 days later he paid the price. The death of Dutch Schultz marked a turning point in American organized crime. It was the moment when the new order fully replaced the old, when the chaotic gang wars of the Prohibition era gave way to the structured corporate-style crime of the mid-20th century. Lucky Luciano and the Commission had proven that they could enforce discipline even among the most powerful and volatile members of the underworld, and that enforcement, brutal as it was, created a stability that allowed organized crime to flourish for generations. Think about the calculation involved. Schultz was worth millions. He controlled profitable operations. He had loyal men and dangerous connections. Killing him would create short-term chaos, force a reorganization, potentially start conflicts as other gangsters fought over his territory. All of that was predictable. But Luciano and the Commission decided that the long-term cost of letting Schultz live was greater than the short-term cost of killing him. They made a strategic decision based on cold logic, and they executed it with ruthless efficiency. That is what separated Lucky Luciano from every other gangster of his era. He could see beyond the immediate, beyond the personal, beyond the emotion. He could make decisions that required sacrificing short-term gains for long-term stability. He could turn violence into a tool of governance rather than an expression of anger. And he could build a system that outlasted him, that survived his own eventual fall and continued to shape organized crime long after he was gone. The Commission still exists today, though it has evolved considerably from its original form. The families that made it up have changed. The operations have adapted to new realities. The methods have become more sophisticated. But the fundamental principle remains the same. Organized crime requires organization. It requires rules, structures, and a willingness to enforce those rules even against powerful members of the club. Dutch Schultz learned that lesson too late. And what of Charles Workman, the man who pulled the trigger? He was eventually identified and convicted not for Schultz's murder but for other crimes. He served time in prison, got out, and lived quietly until his death in the 1970s. He never spoke publicly about the hit on Dutch Schultz, never confirmed or denied his role. That too was part of the code, the understanding that silence was survival. The Palace Chop House no longer exists. The building was torn down decades ago, replaced by modern structures that have no memory of the blood that soaked into those floors. Newark has changed, the city transforming like so much of urban America, the old neighborhoods giving way to new development. But the story remains, passed down through books and documentaries and whispered conversations among those who study the history of organized crime. Because what happened on October 23, 1935, was not just a murder. It was the enforcement of a new world order. It was the triumph of system over chaos, of calculation over impulse, of Lucky Luciano's vision over Dutch Schultz's rage. And it sent a message that echoed through the underworld for generations. Challenge the Commission at your peril. Pull a gun on Lucky Luciano and you have 8 days to live. In the end, the story of Dutch Schultz and Lucky Luciano is a story about power and how it works. Not the cartoonish power of gangster movies where men wave guns and make threats and rule through pure intimidation. But real power, the kind that builds institutions, creates rules, and enforces them with a combination of persuasion and violence. Lucky Luciano understood that kind of power. He knew that the most feared man is not the one who acts on every impulse, but the one who acts deliberately, strategically, and only when necessary. Dutch Schultz never understood that. He thought power was personal, that it came from wealth and toughness and a willingness to kill. He thought that pulling a gun would make the other bosses back down, would prove that he was not to be trifled with. Instead, it proved that he did not understand the rules of the game he was playing. And in a world where breaking the rules could get you killed, that ignorance was fatal. So the next time you hear about Lucky Luciano, about the man who organized the mafia, who created the commission, who changed organized crime forever, remember this story. Remember the meeting in Midtown Manhattan. Remember the gun on the table. Remember the bathroom in Newark and the dying man's incoherent words. Remember that 8 days passed between defiance and death, 8 days in which Dutch Schultz could have fled or begged or changed his mind, but did none of those things because he still did not understand what he had done. And remember that in the world Lucky Luciano built, a world that still exists in modified form today, the rules matter. The structure matters. And challenging that structure, no matter how powerful you think you are, is the last mistake you will ever make. Dutch Schultz pulled a gun on Lucky Luciano. 8 days later, Dutch Schultz was dead, and the underworld learned a lesson that has never been forgotten.